Shalom, holy initiates and holy adepts. Welcome to my holy channel. I'm the Chief Magician of Mystery Babylon. In this video, I'm going to outline a rather detailed curriculum for those who are interested in elevating and taking their holy initiation to the next level. Now, this video is strictly, and I cannot put enough emphasis on the word strictly intended for actual true advanced holy initiates and holy adepts, as we will see here as we get towards the middle part of the video. Now, just to recap, okay, because I'm pretty sure I'm going to have a lot of viewers to this video that do not merit nor are worthy of watching this video, but to recap, the first stage of holy initiation ideally should begin from your childhood, early childhood, until your late teens. Okay, during this time, one would be studying very heavily the Tanakh alongside the New Testament, the Talmudim, the Midrashim, and very ancient texts like those of Philo-Judaeus and Flavius Josephus. Okay. These ancient historical texts are a prerequisite in order to have a better historical understanding and context to these very ancient texts that are being studied and read. Now, again, this is what is ideal. Okay. Now, before I move on, this is very momentous to understand because we need to understand what separates the highest divine men that have ever walked on the face of this earth. I'm talking of individuals like Yeshua, Musha, etc., right? From the rest of the profane and the laity. When we read about Yeshua's life, we read that from the time he was born, all the way up to the time when he became a man, that is when he had his bar mitzvah, he spent all his time studying the Tanakh, the Talmudim, the Midrashim, and the ancient texts. Okay, now you have to be really stupid and really retarded if you don't think these texts existed in his time, because they did. In his generation in Israel, there was huge libraries of very ancient Kabbalistic texts. Yes, many of them were exoteric, but there were also very esoteric texts as well. And Yeshua spent much of his time studying these, for the most part in his early childhood. He spent much of his time studying the exoteric texts, as I just mentioned, okay? And his initiation progressed very heavily as he aged, okay? The point here is that he had what we would call the perfect ideal education, because from the moment he was born, his holy initiation began, and it was very intense, all the time as time progressed. And that's why he was more than a grandmaster. That's why he was Chamashiach Yisrael. And we, his sons, those who are made in his image, we follow a very similar path. And true Jewish parents will start their child early, just like the parents of Yeshua did. Okay? And it is how deep and how intense your initiation is that will determine your level of divinity. Okay, so that's what separated Yeshua from all of his peers, from everyone else. It was the education and initiation that he received and that he was engaged in. Okay, and so when you become a grandmaster, okay, such as myself, what makes a grandmaster so unique and so special is that you're literally one or two levels below the level of divinity of a man, say, like Yeshua, because you've spent your whole life, just like him, studying the holy texts and being initiated. Okay? Divinity, to a very large extent, is a function of your holy initiation and your education. And I cannot stress this enough. Only those that are truly initiated will more than understand what I'm reviewing here. Now we proceed on to the next stage, okay, which we would term classical initiation, which usually is touched upon once you start hitting your late teens and early 20s, which is when you should then begin studying Sefer HaZohar, Sefer Tikkun HaZohar, Sefer Bahir, the works of Plato, Iyam Luchos, Philo Judaeus, Abraham Abulafia, etc. There's a myriad of Kabbalistic texts that one should be engaging in and studying once one reaches this level, right? So the foundation for classical initiation is that you have to be well-founded, well-versed in the Tanakh and the Midrashim and all of the exoteric texts. Because now, in the next stage, in your early 20s, you start getting into the esoteric levels of holy initiation, okay? And studying these texts takes many years, right? In order to fully master and read all of the Zohar, Tikkun HaZohar and Plato, and Luchos, among other texts like these, it's going to take anywhere from 5 to 10 years, okay? Depending on how much time you have and how much time you're dedicating to holy initiation, okay? So this is what we would say is the second stage of holy initiation, okay? So again, we are speaking here in ideal terms, assuming that the first 20 years of your life have been spent mastering the Midrashim, the Talmudim, the Tanakh, because again, the Talmudim, just to read the entire Talmud can take, a good, 5 years, around 5 years or so, okay? It's a very, very large text that takes a lot of time to study and to understand and to master, okay? So these are very powerful, very comprehensive texts, very ancient holy texts that we're dealing with that take a lot of time to master, okay? So again, we're speaking here on an ideal basis, okay? So this second stage represents what somebody in their 20s would start doing. Okay, and so this represents the level of what we'd like to term classical initiation in reading the ancient classical esoteric texts, which primarily are Sefer HaZohar, Sefer Tikkun HaZohar, Sefer Bahir, and we would consider Plato an ancient classical text as well as Iyam Luchos, and you begin to read and touch upon Abraham Abulafia because his texts are very important when it comes to Holy Magic. It is at this time that you also want to begin your initiation into Holy Magic, of which Abraham Abulafia was a grandmaster of, and probably one of the most elite Kabbalists of the past 2,000 years. So his texts are very, I guess you could say they're mandatory as part of classical initiation. Okay, so now we've laid down holistically the entire foundation, okay, that one must have and lay before they proceed to what we then term the penultimate stage of holy initiation, okay? Again, this is the penultimate stage of holy initiation. To get to this level, you would have had to lay all of this groundwork that I have very generally given a high-level overview up to this point. Okay, so the penultimate stage of holy initiation is essentially Lurianic initiation, which is initiation into Lurianic Kabbalah, which would begin anywhere from your mid-20s to your early 30s. Okay, again, there's a large corpus of Lurianic texts. Again, it's going to take a good 5 to 10 years to read and master all of these Lurianic texts. Okay, now stage 1. Now this is the ideal curriculum, okay, for Lurianic initiation from a true grandmaster, none other than me, the chief magician of Mystery Babylon. Okay, considering how ridiculously highly initiated I am. Now, before we begin, it would be ideal if many of you listening have seen a video that I did a while back entitled Introduction into the Lurianic Kabbalah, because you listening should understand that we can see that there are a number of versions of the Lurianic Kabbalah, right? On one level, if we just focus on Chaim Vital, okay, because Chaim Vital was a chief disciple of Eytz Hayyim, and much of the Lurianic corpus comes from Chaim Vital. I would say over 90% of the Lurianic texts are all from Chaim Vital, okay? So just in reference to Chaim Vital's writings, right, there were several redactions that took place of the main body of the Vitalian texts, okay? which means that there are several, we would say we would have several versions of his main body of writings. Now, much of the standard published Italian books in our generation are what have come to become the standard edition texts. Okay, but there are still other versions of those texts that exist. Okay. Now, we also need to understand, okay, so having that understanding in place, we also need to understand that principally, and this is very important to pay attention to, so from this point going forward, you'll want to pay very, very close attention to what I'm revealing and saying here, okay? Understand that principally, there are two main versions of the Lurianic Kabbalah, that is, of the essence, the quintessence of the Lurianic Kabbalah has principally two versions, okay? And those two versions stem from two ridiculously highly initiated grandmasters who were chief disciples of the Arizal, okay? And those two chief grandmasters, well, the first one, as all of you should know, is Chaim Vital, and the other one is an Ashkenazi Jew who goes by the name of Naftali Elchanan, okay? And principally, from the Grandmaster's point of view, these are the two chief Lurianic hierophants, so to speak, okay? Now, we need to understand that Yitzhak Luria had many chief disciples, okay? And these chief disciples, a few of them, put the bulk of his teachings into writing, okay? So we have, at the time after Yitzhak Luria appeared, there was 4 different versions of the Lurianic Kabbalah circulating from at least 4 of Arizal's chief disciples, okay? But the two main principal grandmasters that the grandmasters primarily study are Chaim Vital and Naftali Elchanan. There is another grandmaster, okay, as well, but he wrote only a few. I think he only wrote like 2 or 3 Lurianic texts, okay. But you could essentially say that principally there's 2 versions, but you could technically say there's 3 versions, okay? Maybe I should have said that at the beginning. But essentially, quintessentially, we like to say that there are 2 main principal holistic versions of the Lurianic Kabbalah. That is the true essence and core of the Lurianic Kabbalah, and that's Chaim Vital and Naftali Elchanan, okay? Now, when it comes to the core and essence of the Lurianic Kabbalah, Chaim Vital is considered an inferior source. And it is Naftali Elchanan that is considered the prime and superior source for true Lurianic initiation, which means that stage 1 of Lurianic initiation should, in all respect, begin with his magnus opus, Sefer, Amek, HaMalakh. Now, this is like a 1,000-page book that will very rationally and lucidly teach and reveal and explain the essence and the core of the Lurianic Kabbalah from beginning to end. There is no book that does a better job, that is more lucid, more superior than this magnus opus. Now, this Jew that wrote this book was Ashkenazi, and Chaim Vital was a Sephardic Jew, okay? So essentially, what we see here is that the two essential versions of the Lurianic Kabbalah, are split down the line between what we would call the Ashkenazi version and the Sephardic version. Now this gets interesting because, and this is just a side note, you know, a lot of people usually equate Sephardic Jews as being, you know, darker skinned or dark skinned Jews. And generally speaking, that's the case, but not all Sephardic Jews are very dark skinned, you know, or tan, so to speak. For example, I'm a Sephardic Jew. You know, I come from a very ancient aristocratic Sephardic Jewish bloodline. Some of you know I'm of the house of King David, and for all intents and purposes, even though my family is Sephardic, many of my family members look Ashkenazi. I have many family members that are very pale-skinned. You know, for example, my mom was pale-skinned, green eyes, red hair. You know, so there's a lot of Ashkenazi-looking Jews in my bloodline, even though technically we are all Sephardic Jews. But there's a lot of Sephardic Jews that look Ashkenazi, but are not Ashkenazi. Okay, so that's really important. I think that's something that I think a lot of the Goyim don't, you know, understand or really know. And I say this because, you know, as a Sephardic Jew, I have a Sephardic bias to a very large extent, but at the same time, you know, there's pros and cons to each, you know, to each tradition, so to speak. And with respect to this case and dealing with you know, the Lurianic Kabbalah, it just so happened that the true superior form of the Lurianic Kabbalah was penned and redacted by an Ashkenazi Jew, not the Sephardic Jew Chaim Vital. Okay, and so what happened over time, over the generations, is that all of the Sephardic Jews, the vast majority of not all Sephardic Jews, but the vast majority of Sephardic Jews only stuck with Chaim Vital's Lurianic teachings. The vast majority of Sephardic Jews rejected Naftali Elchanan's Magnus Opus to their own detriment, because Chaim Vital's, you know, his core Lurianic texts are very flawed, contain errors, and are very inferior in nature. And so this is very, very sad what happened in the Sephardic community, because now you have many inferior initiated Sephardic Jews out of the stupidity and ignorance of rejecting Naftali Elchanan's Magnus Opus. And all the Ashkenazi Jews, the vast majority of them now, are more highly initiated, more intelligent, and more knowledgeable than much of the Sephardic Jews, because they latched on to the superior, you know, correct Lurianic version, which was Naftali Elchanan's version of the Lurianic Kabbalah. And, you know, this is an observation that isn't lost on much of the world. You know, when we look at the Jews that, generally speaking, are considered to be more superior with respect to wealth, intelligence, and health, generally speaking, we find that the Ashkenazi Jews tend to be more blessed and more superior than to their Sephardic counterparts. Of course, it pains me greatly to say this as a Sephardic Jew. Again, as I mentioned, I'm a Sephardic Jew, even though you know, we're not technically dark-skinned, you know, so to speak, Jews. Not to say that being dark-skinned, you know, is inferior in any way. But generally speaking, this is what we find among the Ashkenazi Jews. We find that it is the white Jews, generally speaking, that tend to have the highest intellects and, you know, are always the most initiated when it comes to the holy mysteries, etc. Okay, and these are just the facts. Okay, they're inconvenient truths, but they're the facts. And so what we find is that the Ashkenazi Jews, after Arizal, tended to become the most initiated than the Sephardic Jews. The Sephardic Jews lost their place in terms of ranking, you know, unfortunately, as a result of Chaim Vital's inferior redactions that took place. Okay, so again, to recap, stage 1 of Lurianic initiation, so for all intents and purposes, begin with Sefer Amek HaMalakh. It is considered the primary source for Lurianic initiation and the primary text for all Lurianic initiation. Unfortunately, this book has no English translation, although in the Middle Ages, when Kabbalah Denutata was published, there was a Latin translation of many parts of Sefer Amek HaMalakh that were included in there. But good luck getting a true complete version of Kabbalah Denutata that would contain these sections, let alone translated into English from the Latin. Good luck if you can do that. Okay, so now that we've mentioned stage 1, okay, which you're going to have to be fluent in Hebrew and Aramaic to fully master and study this text, okay? So if you can do that, that's great, because that's where Lurianic initiation begins. If you do not begin, if your Lurianic initiation does not begin with this text, then it is going to be a very inferior initiation, and a very tough one at that. So once you have read and mastered that book, stage 2 then would begin in reading Chaim Vital's works. Okay, so at this point, you can start reading the Vitalian texts, and it's a good thing, because once you start reading the Vitalian text, then you can start to understand the differences and the contradictions between Naftali El-Hanan's version and Chaim Vital's version, because there's many contradictions between the two versions. Believe it or not, they don't agree. Okay, and it's on very, very momentous matters. In fact, the next video I will be uploading is going to go very deep into one of these matters. But we know that Chaim Vital, the core and principal magnus opus of Chaim Vital is what's known as the 8 gates, which were 8 treatises. And I don't have all the 8 gates listed here on the screen, but I have the gates that I would consider to be the most important to study, and the ones that are in bold I would consider mandatory for holy initiation and becoming a grandmaster. So we have Eytz Hayyim. As I've stated in other videos, Eytz Hayyim is a very inferior text with many errors, and it's one of the problems with it is it's very discursive in nature, difficult to understand at times. But I think that the most difficult and annoying part of Eytz Hayyim is that it's written very discursively. So as a result of that, most Kabbalists begin initiation by reading Otzrot Chaim, which is considered to be the primer and primary text for Vitalian initiation. So for Lurianic initiation, among the Sephardim, their primary and prime text is Sefer Otzrot Chaim. It's much less discursive than say Eytz Hayyim, and it's considered a foundational text in preparation for reading Eytz Hayyim and better understanding Eytz Hayyim. But again, these texts are inferior. I still think that it's good to study them so that you can compare and contrast between two versions and come to your own conclusion on those matters that seem rather difficult, to understand or comprehend. Now, there are 3 texts here that I consider prerequisite and mandatory to complete your holistic Lurianic initiation. The first of these texts is Ma'amarei Rashbi, which is one of the 8 gates. And this gate includes much of the Apocrypha and secret teachings of the Rashbi and Chaim Vital's very brilliant elucidation and revelation of the Apocrypha and secret teachings of the Rashbi. It is an invaluable, very advanced Lurianic text. The next one is Sefer HaPasukim, which is an extremely esoteric, Lurianic, Kabbalistic revelation of many of the verses in the Torah and in the Tanakh. Very, very advanced Lurianic text. And the third and final book, which I consider to be probably the greatest of these 3 books, is Sefer Likutim, which is essentially an extremely advanced, esoteric, Lurianic commentary to the Torah, straight from the Arizal. It doesn't get any better than this. In fact, just to give you a memory, this was a very fond memory that I had. So when I first opened Sefer Likutim, the first page begins with Parashat Bereshith, right? The commentary begins with Parashat Bereshith, which the Torah begins with Parashat Bereshith. And I remember opening the book and reading the very first sentence, right, to his commentary that begins with Parashat Bereshith. And I was just flabbergasted at just the first most esoteric, most powerful divine revelation that was given. And the reason was because when you reach the last stage of holy initiation, which is Shabbatainism and Frankism, having mastered and read the Apocrypha and the secret teachings of HaMashiach Yaakov Frank, you will find that Yaakov Frank quotes a lot from the very esoteric Lurianic texts. And much of his teachings are extensions and divine revelations from the Lurianic corpus. And there's this very, very powerful divine revelation and arcanum that he reveals in his secret teachings that comes straight out of Sefer Likutim, specifically the first sentence in Sefer Likutim. And so these three books that I have here in bold that I've mentioned are the most advanced of the Lurianic text, and some of the most invaluable and the best of the Lurianic text. And one of the things that I really like about Chaim Vital is that he writes Hebrew in a very simple manner. Every Rab has their own method of writing. Some Rabbanim write in a very intellectual, advanced manner that's difficult to understand, like say Abraham Abulafia, and then other Rabbanim like Chaim Vital write in a very, very simple way. Like they write in a very, very simple manner that's very clear, very lucid. Like they write, like a layman, so to speak, so that even a layman can understand, right? It's very, very simplistic writing, the way in which they write and teach. And that's one of the strengths and things that I love about Chaim Vital, is that you can tell that this was a very simplistic, very, very humble Zadig, just by the way in which he wrote. And it makes understanding and reading his text easy. I think of all the Kabbalistic texts, Chaim Vital's is one of the easiest. Chaim Vital's books are some of the easiest to read and understand, because of his simplistic way of writing in Hebrew. So that represents the penultimate stage of Lurianic initiation. Now, I'll conclude by revealing the English translations. Now, as I said a while back, it is very unfortunate that there is currently no English translation of Sefer Amek HaMalakh, which is probably the greatest Lurianic text out there. So that's very, very sad. In fact, I've been thinking a lot lately about doing a partial English translation of the text at some point in the future. I don't know when, but I think it's very sad. But here I have listed, so below in the description, you're going to find links to where to purchase these books. These are the only known English translations of the Lurianic text. Now, we'll begin with one of the 8 gates is Shaar HaGilgulim, which is the Gate of Reincarnations. And that English translation does exist that you can purchase online. Also, Shaar Ruah HaQodesh, there's also an English translation for that. I have not read that English translation, so I don't know how good it is. I imagine it's very good, but it's very expensive. I think I could be wrong if I remember correctly. I think it was produced in 3 tomes, and I think it's going to set you close to $1,000. It's going to cost you $1,000 to purchase an English translation of Shaar Ruah HaQodesh, but this is probably one of the most advanced and esoteric texts of Chaim Vital. So well worth it, if you ask me, if you have the money, of course. Now, there are 3 different translations of Eytz Hayyim. One is complete. So the complete English translation of Eytz Hayyim is very expensive. You're talking about you're talking about close to $1,000 to get the full complete English translation of Eytz Hayyim. The other version is the first 15 gates of the 50 gates of Eytz Hayyim that have been translated. Can be purchased very cheaply, and then there's another version that translates the first 7 gates of the 50 gates. So that's good. Then there is Ramchal's 138 openings of Chokhmah, which is an advanced Kabbalistic / Lurianic text, which there is also an English translation for. Now, the problem with Ramchal, this is my own personal opinion. I consider Ramchal's 138 openings of wisdom to be an extremely, extraordinarily inferior Kabbalistic text. I consider it to be one of the most inferior Kabbalistic texts that I've ever read. Yes, the Ramchal was a grandmaster, but I think that he did an extremely horrible, atrocious job in his composition of this book. And it's just a very inferior Kabbalistic text. I got nothing out of reading that book. There's a lot of things that are missing in that book. I think there's even errors in that book. It's a horrible book. I don't know what happened. When it comes down to Ramchal's Lurianic initiation, I don't know what happened. Maybe he wrote this book when he was first initiated into Lurianic Kabbalah and didn't fully understand it. I don't know, but to me, it's an extremely, extraordinarily inferior Lurianic text, especially when you compare it to a text like, say, Sefer Amek HaMalakh. Sefer Amek HaMalakh is one of the most glorious and greatest Kabbalistic books that has ever been written, bar none. And there's no Lurianic text or book that comes close to how great and glorious that book is. In fact, just to give you an anecdote as to how ridiculously esoteric and advanced and glorious Sefer Amek HaMalakh is. So before I began my Lurianic initiation, I received a lot of very powerful, very esoteric divine revelations from Hashem. Okay. Now at the time, these divine revelations to me were so esoteric that I didn't know of anyone else that knew this knowledge and this wisdom that Hashem was revealing to me. Okay. At the time, also bear in mind, I had not yet been fully initiated into the Lurianic Kabbalah. And so what happened was that, as I began to become initiated and as I began to read, Sefer Amek HaMalakh, I began to read certain sections in the book where these very esoteric divine revelations that Hashem had given me, well, guess what? Here I am reading Sefer Amek HaMalakh, and I am finding these very revelations in certain sections in this book. And there's nothing more beautiful, there's nothing more great and more beautiful than having esoteric divine revelations confirmed to you by another grandmaster in one of his books. So remember, I had Hashem give me a lot of esoteric divine revelations that I then had confirmed when I read Sefer Amek HaMalakh. And it's just like a very supernatural, very beautiful, enthralling experience. And I'm like, wow, the fact that this grandmaster is revealing these very esoteric things in this book that Hashem revealed to me is proof that this guy is a ridiculously highly initiated grandmaster. Because these divine revelations that are revealed in Sefer Amek HaMalakh are revealed nowhere else in any other Kabbalistic books. The only way that he could have been initiated at this level was because he was a true grandmaster, but even more so because he was a chief disciple of HaMashiach Arizal. So I'll conclude this presentation on that very beautiful anecdote. Again, the links to purchase these English translations, as well as Sefer Amek HaMalakh, are below in the description box. Shalom, Wassalam.